Brilliant. So it's 11:01, so I'm going to get us started, and people can filter in whilst I'm banging on at the top here about this Local Resilience Act campaign, which is what this webinar today and this paper that we put out today, Defining Resilience, is all about. It's about this campaign that we at Localis are running over the course of this year for a statutory duty for local resilience. My name is Joe Fines. I'm the head of research at Localis, and I'm joined by three excellent panelists today to talk about it. So we're joined by Chitra Nadarajah, who's the head of climate change and environmental strategy at Hampshire County Council. We're joined by Catriona Riddell, national strategic planning specialist at the Planning Officer Society and Localis Research Fellow. And we're joined by Professor Samuel Bagaeen, Localis Fellow, a man of many, many hats, including currently working for Arcadis on planning. So to just give a quick brief overview of this Local Resilience Act campaign, what we're talking about, why we're talking about it. Then I'm going to just quickly go over the paper today, and then we'll get into comments from our panelists, and then hopefully into some discussion and debate as well. So in terms of what we're talking about when we say a Local Resilience Act, what we mean is essentially a statutory duty with a tax revenue funding for local authorities to shore up within their planning, within their built environment, within their land management, climate resilience and adaptation. It's about raising the baseline for action on climate resilience and removing the ceiling that is currently placed on action for climate resilience. And we're doing that through research, events like this one, and stakeholder engagement throughout the year. And we very much see this as being an ongoing conversation. This isn't kind of sort of a think tank. Here's what you want to do. Here's the big idea. It's very much we're not sure. We're trying to have these conversations throughout the year to find what is needed to fill a gap that we think we've identified. And when I say a gap, I think we came by honestly in the sense of last year we did an expansive study for the District Councils Network on clean growth, on decarbonisation, and what councils can do at different levels to drive decarbonisation and promote a sustainable, inclusive growth in their area. And what we found was, as we spoke to all these different officers and experts up and down the country, I wouldn't go so far to say a blind spot, but something of an ambiguity around the issue of resilience and what we're supposed to be doing for the future. There was a lot on decarbonisation, on cutting emissions now, on changing behaviours, but there was some councils felt they didn't really know what they should be doing, and as a result weren't doing much. Because, as most people on the call will know, within the national planning policy framework, you don't have a lot of space to sort of go out on your own, and particularly the capacity constraints that councils have. So they just weren't doing much. And we even found in some places, officers that were trying to do quite a lot around their local plan for resilience that were being told by the planning inspectorate, this is too much. So, there's the ceiling is too low and the baseline is too low currently for resilience is what we found. And we thought an act might be some way to get that universal standard together so that I, as a planning officer, hypothetically speaking, would know what national resilience looked like and how that broke down to my place, or to sort of flip it, how my local resilience should aggregate up to a nation resilient to climate change. So we've been putting out research, and doing events around this theme over the course of the year. Today, we released Defining Resilience, written by my colleague, Sandy Forsyth, which is essentially a paper looking at the different ways that resilience is defined across legislation, different government bodies, NGOs, INGOs, charities, to look at how resilience is applied in different contexts, and really to try and think how that boils down to the local state with all the various things it does. And we've finished it with 7 key principles, which we think an LOA would need to factor in, which you can find in the paper on our website, or indeed there's a link in the chat. So to move on to this webinar with our panelists today, we tried to sort of put together a few guiding questions, but we're really open to whatever the panelists want to talk about around this theme of defining resilience. We're asking, what does climate resilience look like in different parts of the UK? We're asking, how can local authorities ascertain what the correct approach is in their area to shoring up resilience? And we're asking, does the UK need some kind of framework, some kind of statutory definition of resilience to set a minimum standard for public authorities, local authorities and otherwise? So with that in mind, I'll get our panelists involved now. We'll go through sort of 7 minutes each-ish, max, if you could, and then we'll come back around. I'll ask some questions. We'll get some questions for the audience, hopefully, as well. You can put those in the chat or in the Q&A function, however you want to get that out there. We will read it. So I'm going to start with Chitra, if that's okay with you, to get us started on Monday morning, and hand over to Chitra Nadarajah from the Hampshire County Council.
Thank you. I'm not a planner, so first and foremost, but I have worked for Hampshire for over 20 years. And actually my first job at the County Council was a climate change officer. And at the time, resilience was actually the focus of our work, not mitigation, which I know is really unusual. And I used to work on a European project called ESPAS, which is about embedding climate change into spatial planning, and Catriona will know about that because CERA, at the time, the Southeast Regional Assembly, was one of the partners. And that project kind of did get the Environment Agency started on their Thames Estuary 2100 decision pathways. So, you know, we're talking 20 years of this now, and I'm not entirely sure that we're that much further ahead than we were 20 years ago. So I guess it is interesting, you know, asking the question about whether we need something more statutory at a local level. I think there's always a bit of a challenge with statutory duties in terms of what it brings and what it doesn't, and you know, I'll get into that in a minute. But there's also something about the way in which we are able to implement solutions at a local level. I think a lot of local authorities start by thinking that they're all extremely unique, and Hampshire's included. And there is something about the fact that we're not actually all extremely unique. There is a certain amount of things that can be done that are consistent. And where there are local authorities that have been forging ahead, particularly places like Reading, for example, there are things that we can certainly copy and use at a local level, and then start to adapt for our specific needs in our place. So there is a point at which some of that stuff becomes quite important in terms of making it more localized, but I think there is a lot that is available out there that we can use, and we don't have to kind of start from scratch. You know, I've sat on DEFRA's local adaptation advisory panel for, I don't know, over 10 years now. And certainly within that team, you know, we've been trying very hard to understand what the issues are in terms of embedding resilience in local government. And there are many issues, some of which you've picked up in your paper. For Hampshire County Council, we're a county council, so we don't deliver local plans, but we have set ourselves 2 targets when it comes to the climate emergency. One to be carbon neutral by 2050, but the other was to be resilient to a 2-degree rise in temperature, which I think is quite an unusual thing to have that target. And obviously this links back to the fact that we've been working on resilience for over 20 years. Having said that, it's still not easy. So we've created 2 decision tools within the County Council. So all of our key member decisions have to be tested against these 2 questions. One, how can your project or your program or whatever it is you're asking for a decision for reduce the carbon impact? And 2, how is it essentially being resilient to the impacts of climate change? And that's mandatory, and that's been part of our decision process for about 2 years now. So for me, I think the statutory duty is a challenging one. You know, we've seen the Skidmore review ask for something similar, and that was obviously rejected. I think a lot of local authorities might say no to a statutory duty, actually, interestingly, because the resources are never quite enough to make up for the duty itself. And, you know, as I said, I'm not a planner, and in the paper you released, there is a huge amount of guidance and policy hooks within existing legislation that can bring resilience to the fore within local plans, within planning. But for me, I think the main issue is capacity and skills. You know, that's essentially what's lacking. And going on a training course is not really going to be sufficient. I know the TCPA, for example, do really brilliant training courses around this. I think it's about how we actually make that reality within a local plan. And often that's the point at which there is so much going on. There's a lot to think about. And resilience, although is important to quite a lot of these authorities, it's just really difficult to know how to incorporate that in reality. So I think for me, there's the kind of biggest challenge is how do we create that space for local authorities to be able to respond to this in a way that is holistic. You know, and I think the TCPA really set it out so nicely in terms of the kind of 4 key areas of place, people, space, and time. And those are the 4 things that you do need to consider when you're doing a local plan or, you know, making planning decisions or anything really. And if you don't have that expertise and you don't have those skills, resilience is actually a really difficult thing to get your head around, especially when the timeframes are so long. You know, we're talking 100+ years. The interdependencies is a huge issue when it comes to resilience as well. Maladaptation is another big problem. You know, so I think there's a lot there. So yeah, so I think that for me, it's the capacity and the resources is the biggest challenge. And, you know, I think for local government, we should have some duties when it comes to climate change as a whole. So I do kind of think that is just because we have to recognize how important this is. If we're calling it an emergency, we should be treating it like one.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Chitra. Great start. I'm already realized I'm going to need more paper, I think, from scribbling down all these questions. But so plenty to get us started with there. But moving on now to Catriona Riddell, National Strategic Planning Specialist at the Planning Officer Society and Localis Research Fellow, for your thoughts on the issue of defining resilience.
Thanks. Yeah, a lot of what she was just saying is very much at the forefront of my mind when I was thinking about this. And for me, there's three big issues and potentially three solutions and things that can help deal with this. And I think the main issue for me is about policy integration, public policy integration. And we've just touched on that, but I think that has to start at the top. And even though we've got a new Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, that we should have one all-embracing policy around climate resilience that feeds right across every department and every government agency, and that integration both horizontally but also vertically right down through to the local level, right through to parish councils. And I think that's one of the other missing links. They shouldn't be they should have responsibilities around this as well, every part of local government. And I think that fragmented governance system we've had, particularly since 2010, has done an awful lot of harm. We've lost an awful lot of time in terms of developing it. And, SPAS and all the other brilliant work that was done nationally around building climate resilience, adaptation and mitigation, was pretty much thrown in the bin for a lot of places, and we're having to rebuild that. But I think that sort of fragmented system where we've got too many departments, too many partnerships, too many individual bodies all trying to do the same thing but doing it in a different way, and we need to get on top of that. And we're beginning to see some departments, DFT, for example, I think are probably one of the ones that's way ahead. That DEFRA and DFT are way ahead. I think DLUC, sadly, is the one that's way behind in terms of this, and I think they need to, given that they are responsible for local authorities and housing, which is a massive area that we need to address. I think we need to get DLUC more on top of what their role is around climate change. And there's no doubt the dismantling of the regional architecture has had a big impact on that. And it's not just around what the regional assemblies were saying around spatial planning or what the regional economic bodies were saying around how we build, climate resilience through our economic policies and our investment strategy, but also the government offices, because they did that magical joining up of government policy at a local level, but equally they fed back up to the national level in terms of that local intelligence, what was happening on the ground, and we have no ability to do that. We've got mayors and combined authorities increasingly, and we've got potentially a huge number of new devolution deals and new county combined authorities, but I've read pretty much all of them, and while they've got some really good commitments around climate change, particularly around transport and how that's going to deal with it, there is no spatial planning aspect to pretty much any of this. And spatial planning for me is, and I'm not talking just about the statutory planning system, I'm talking about spatial planning in all its abilities. That's not mentioned. There's very few of them that have any powers or even want any powers around that. And that is the ringmaster to sustainable growth, in my view. That is where we bring all these different roles and responsibilities together. So we have to tackle that. I think the second issue for me is around leadership and having a much stronger governance. We've got counties, districts, we've got combined authorities, we've got parish councils. In many parts of the country, we've got 2 tiers of local authorities. County councils are lead flood risk authorities, they are minerals and waste authorities, they're responsible for nature recovery frameworks, they're transport authorities, yet they have they have no spatial planning powers, and they are working within a very fragmented local governance system. And frankly, planning at the local level is having to do an awful lot of the heavy lifting, and the statutory planning system was never set up to do that. So I think we need to find a way that takes the burden of building climate resilience and taking some of these really important issues out of the statutory planning system, with the statutory planning system working alongside that and complementing it, but not expecting it to do all the heavy lifting. And with that comes difficult decisions that a lot of local councillors aren't able to deal with. And you know, the point that Chitra just made about this being long term, making some very long term difficult decisions in the interest of the greater good when you've got elections every year is really difficult. And you know, we've seen recently big debates around greenbelt, around housing, and we all know how political planning is, and that monopolises everything that we do in planning, housing, and things like greenbelt, housing numbers. And we, you know, we don't get the opportunity to really deal with the sort of building the climate resilience through our local planning system. And then you end up with situations, some of you will be familiar with Saltcroft's proposal for a new community in West Oxfordshire, where the inspector basically said it wasn't sound because it was trying to do too much in terms of delivering net zero. And that challenge is still there. That is still ongoing. You know, the challenge TCPA are very much active in that field as well, to say, look, you know, we haven't got another route through here, so we're using the planning system to try and do as best we possibly can. That proposal had full support from local community. Every bit of development that was going to come out of that proposal had to deliver net zero. That was gold plated, yet it wasn't good enough, or in this case it had gone too far. And I'll finish in terms of the issues for me. Absolutely, skills and resources. You know, there's no point in having a gold-plated local plan that has climate change embedded all the way through when the people making decisions or dealing with planning applications don't have the skills or the expertise, or can't tap in to the skills or expertise to provide some really robust decision making. And that applies to the politicians. So for me, there's three things we need to do. First of all, I absolutely agree. We need some form of separate legal regulatory system around climate resilience that the planning system can sit alongside, take some of that heavy lifting away from the planning system and put it in the right place. Secondly, I think we need a national spatial framework that builds climate resilience right into the heart of it, and that sits on top of all the other public policy frameworks we've got. And actually looks at what our spatial priorities are and how we can use the spatial planning system, but also other spatial things to actually really embed this into public policy. And then finally, we need to find some way of boosting skills and capacity. And if that means sharing teams, sharing responsibilities, building county-based teams that that are shared right across. And you know, we frankly can't afford to keep going on the way we're going on anyway in terms of the two-tier system, in my view. But we really need to get a grip of this and actually start really building up our capacity in this area so that we're making decisions that are going to build our resilience for the future. That's me.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Catriona. That's fascinating. Loads to chew on there. And I definitely think we should get into the skills issue in the discussion. But first and foremost, let's bring on Samir Bagaeen, Localis Fellow, Technical Director within the Environmental Planning Team at Localis, RICS Fellow, RSA Fellow, University of Kent, all that stuff. Knows a lot about resilience. Samir Bagaeen.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I have to say I also worked for the Rockefeller Foundation's Resilience Program, and actually that's where, you know, that relationship between organizations that support resilience and cities becomes really, really interesting, and the levels at which these things happen. And, you know, while spatial planning is important in this conversation, interestingly, there were and continues to be, I think, even in the cities that are doing integrated or have done integrated resilience strategies funded by Rockefeller and others, even the resilience program at the UN, for example, and the World Bank, there's very little planning engagement. So there's very little by way of planners actually being around the table, helping setting targets for resilience or writing resilience strategies. And I think that's probably one of the more crucial bits within an act, is there a role for planners around the table? And the answer, and my answer at least, let me frame it this way, in the current system, there isn't. Because the current system, even when you look at the resilience framework, you know, the whole society approach to resilience, which was published by Cabinet Office, was a couple of months ago, and the roots of that which sit in the Civil Contingencies Act, there's no planners are on the table. There's no planners written into that script. There's no planners written into the operational solutions. And as a result, when you drill down and look at local resilience forums, which do a lot of the stuff around resilience in towns, cities, and counties, there are no planners, because all of that framework that governs the work that happens in response to disasters or tragedies or flooding, you know, it doesn't assume that planners have a role. And I think we have to change that basic assumption. You know, we've had students at Kent in the past that have been running audits for the last 5 years, trying to find a planner sitting around the table in a local resilience forum somewhere where a local resilience forum operates. And there isn't, and there hasn't been. And I think that's one of the things that need to change. Now, resilience itself is a very interesting concept, as you know, and the document defining resilience is an interesting one. But I would add to what's in that and actually say, you know, when we talk about resilience, we have to be very precise in terms of what we mean. And I know we've had Chitra and Catriona talk about climate resilience, for example, but we can, and these are all terms that are being used across not only government departments, across local government, across international agencies. You know, so there's talk of city resilience, urban resilience, operational resilience, social resilience, economic resilience, health resilience, infrastructure resilience, digital resilience, and disaster resilience. You know, so stick any word in front of resilience and, you know, you've got your work cut out for you. And we do have a couple of things that, you know, you and the team might want to lean back on, but I think the way they were written, they're probably way too complex to be of any use to, you know, operationally and in practice. And I'm talking about the city resilience, the BSI standards, the BS 67000 was written in 2019. I'm not sure anybody uses it. You know, I'm sure the BSI would stand firm on its utility, but actually the way it's written and phrased means that operationally, it's actually very difficult to then take and actually do something within local government. And I think, you know, so the utility of anything that comes out of this conversation would be critical. It has to be something that local government uses. It has to be something, I think, that central government across all of its constituent bits that do work on resilience, they need to unify around. And, you know, by that, I mean, so DLUC was mentioned, DEFRA was mentioned, Cabinet Office that does a lot of stuff on resilience, but tend to operate in its own little bubble. You know, they need to come on board, the Environment Agency, Natural England, you know, so all of those agencies that actually are involved in resilience capacity and resilience building in that respect, both of hard infrastructure, but also of the social infrastructure are absolutely critical. And you'll remember when we did the surface tensions report last year, you know, while we talked about the physical infrastructure that's needed and the commitment to build that physical infrastructure. And I know, you know, there was a lot of it in the pipeline. What that report then flagged was actually the social resilience bit is where you need to build some of the investment in, because while it's very easy to either recover and build the infrastructure or build the infrastructure to mitigate, if you are flooded as a member of the public, it would take you years to recover. You know, you might get your home repaired and fixed within a year or two, but actually it's the social resilience piece that's really, really critical and the more difficult one to quantify and measure and then take action on. So that's the bit I think that should be an important part of a Resilience Act, because it's something that's missing from the current frameworks, you know, whether they sit across local government or whether they sit across central government or whether they sit elsewhere. And that's why then coming back to a definition of resilience, and I know, you know, you've got your defining resilience. There's so many definitions of resilience that have been around since 1973, you know, so we're not necessarily short of what is resilience in a particular context. But if you take one which I particularly like, which is the capacity of communities, government, organizations, systems, and individuals to survive, adapt, grow, and thrive no matter what acute shocks or chronic stresses come their way. And it's actually that thriving bit, which is critical. And that's where that social bit comes in. That's where the health bit comes in. That's where the economic bit comes in, you know, and these words kind of attached to the word resilience at the back end. And the other one, in addition to capacity and skills, which I think is critical, is the complexity theory that actually hovers around all of this. So we need to recognize, both in the act and in the debates happening in public, that when we talk about operational resilience, social resilience, economic resilience, infrastructure resilience, etc., that these things are connected, and we just need to recognize and acknowledge the interconnections that exist. And we need to recognize that this is a very complex set of systems that operate within one system, which you do not get in any cross-cutting work, whether in central government at the moment or across local government. And by that, I mean the different tiers of local government. Greater Manchester has tried to do that, in that they're building a resilience strategy across the territory of the combined authority. Glasgow, Bristol, Belfast are doing it at city level. The GLA is doing it across the GLA territory as well. You know, so we have got examples of different scales of capacity building for resilience happening. And it might be worth just looking at the lessons that either have been learned or are being learned as a result of that. And I will stop there, Joe.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Samir. And if you could, that last definition of resilience you gave there, Richard Hood has asked in the chat if you could post where he could see those definitions. That'd be really helpful. Thank you very much. So to get into discussion, please do send in your questions into the Q&A box or into the chat. I have a few I just want to go over based on one sort of theme that I think came through all three panelists, which was the idea of sort of what scale, how many types of places are there? You know, Chitra opened up with a very good and provocative point that, you know, ultimately councils are maybe not as different as they all think they are. You know, everybody always says they got a lot of small businesses. Everywhere does. You know, this everywhere says they got an old housing stock. Everywhere does. So the question is, well, what if you were to apply a framework? What sort of, where would you set the standards? To what specificity would you create that framework? So I'm sort of going to go in reverse and ask the question in slightly different ways, based on expertise and what was said. So I think, Samir, first of all, what are the fundamental differences between urban resilience and non-urban resilience? What do cities need to consider specifically?
Well, that's an interesting one. So cities generally find it easy to think of resilience in terms of, probably like everybody else, you know, how your ability to respond to a particular shock or a stress. And by shock or a stress, it could be a natural disaster, so it could be flooding, or it could be something which is an ongoing thing that's affecting your town or city. And that could be congestion, it could be air pollution, you know, and that's what we mean by a stress. So there are these ongoing things that kind of are constant problems for cities versus the shocks that come in. So sometimes cities find it easy to think of resilience as a response to either one of these. Now, COVID has then taught us since then that actually there's this other thing that kind of sits alongside some of these, and this is the complexity theory bit where it becomes very interesting. You know, so while you're dealing with air pollution and you're trying to solve for air pollution, whether through a ULEZ expansion or not, for example, an ultra low emission zone expansion, which isn't necessarily thought of as a resilience building measure, but it's sort of thought of as a let's clean up our air measure, which ultimately then leads to better resilience. But it also then leads, and this is the complexity theory coming in, it also leads to a healthier population. You know, so you're building the health of the population and you're building your health resilience capacity, if you like. So that's where we kind of move from an intervention on the infrastructure side, you know, so an urban resilience or a city resilience, but actually you begin to see how it then impacts on the resilience of the community. Now, if you take, again, the ULEZ expansion is a really good example to maybe unpack this a bit more, because when you then think about the economic resilience, you know, so something that's contributing very positively to urban resilience and health resilience may, as some people have argued, have a counterproductive effect on the economic resilience of the broader system. Because again, you know, and we're talking about that East London, Kent kind of, fluffy boundary between the two and that movement which happens and ignores kind of lines drawn on a map. So it will have some economic impacts, which may not necessarily lead to building resilience, but actually they will kind of cause damage to some of the economic activity. So sometimes you need to look at that whole system piece, so a positive intervention on an urban resilience has a positive intervention and an positive impact on your health resilience, but then it might have a detrimental or, not so favorable impact on your economic resilience as well. So that's where you kind of begin to move from one into the other. The other bits that I mentioned, so digital, for example, and operational, then become the tools that you begin to assess and measure some of these. Again, so you can't take them entirely out of that equation. So you probably begin to look at, some of the digital tools that local government has available to it in order to assess, whether any of these impacts have had the impact that it is said that they have had or will have in this case. But that's just, again, in a nutshell, that kind of very, if we try and unpack and peel off urban resilience from city resilience, from health resilience, and from economic resilience, it just acknowledge that none of them exists in a vacuum on its own, and they do exist in a whole system, which is why one of the, probably if we go back to skills, you probably need professionals with the ability to look at a whole systems approach, and we just haven't got enough of those at the moment.
No, it's that aggregation, isn't it, of places, how the urban resilience affects the surrounding area, et cetera. And Catriona, sort of following on from that, you talked about kind of the death of regional planning with the off to the regions, et cetera, and we talked about, it was mentioned, Greater Manchester having a strategy. What do you think is a good scale for resilience? Obviously, all tiers of government need to get involved, as you mentioned, but are the regions a good way of doing it, or is that just what we already had, those 9 regions? What if you were starting from scratch, where would you put it?
So I have always worked in a system where you have both strategic planning and economic planning and transport planning done at both the regional and sub-regional scale. For me, and I know people will disagree, but I think the best system we had was when we had regional planning guidance and structure plans. Now, you can argue the toss about whether it sits with the county level or whatever, but we have so many different spatial geographies, whether you're looking at a river catchment area, Greenbelt's a classic one, whether you're looking at transport corridors, whether you're looking at housing market areas, minerals and waste market areas, all of these different things have different spatial geographies. So what we have to do is try and capture it at a level that makes sense. And one of the things I think that we've really lost the ability to do, one of the magical things we had at a regional level was an ability to gather data on a consistent basis across the regions and build up a national picture and analyse that. And that intelligence through our sort of data observatories, regional data observatories, was really, really important in terms of taking things forward planning, as well as looking at past impact. So I think whatever you can argue the toss at what a sub-regional scale looks like, but we do need to have that sort of regional and sub-regional scale working together, and we do need to have a much better approach to a consistent approach to how we measure things and how we look at impacts and how we deal with that, use that intelligence, and that builds up to the national picture. And I think just building on what Samir's just been talking about, there's 2 classic examples around at the moment. One is around nutrient neutrality and water neutrality. These affect big areas. You can't do these and look at it in a local level. They also impact on how house builders are going to build in the future in terms of their build methods. They impact on what the Environment Agency does, what Natural England does. They impact on how we plan, how we deal with individual applications. They deal with water resources. You look at what's happening in Horsham, where that whole area, they can't permit anything because they've not got enough water. Now, all of this is planning by crisis management. We've known about this for decades, yet we wait until the very last minute where we deal with it. So now there's a massive rush with everybody getting involved because we can't build any houses. And back to Samir's point, it's not just about the impact on water quality, it's about the fact that we can't deliver the housing that we need, we can't deliver the infrastructure that we need. In the case of water supply issues, we've got a massive gap between the national level and the local level in terms of infrastructure. So the old South East plan, in my experience, we were looking at 2 new reservoirs to deal with that. None of that has happened because it got lost, because we've got national infrastructure, we've got local infrastructure, and around water, nothing sitting in between. The other example I would give, which I think is a classic sort of systems approach, is Greenbelt. The debate around Greenbelt is so polarised around it's a planning policy tool, it's not green infrastructure, etc. Well, if it's a planning policy tool and you've designated land as Greenbelt, then we should be sweating our assets. We should be making absolute best use of every bit of land that we've got. If it's open land, and the argument from a lot of developers is it might be a scrappy bit of brownfield land in the Greenbelt, then build on it. No, if it's a scrap, if it works from a planning policy perspective, then we actually open up access, we improve its nature quality, its biodiversity, and we actually use it as much as possible. The problem is house builders won't do that because it's not in their interest to improve the quality of a bit of Greenbelt, because they're hoping, they've got hope value attached to that for the future. So we need to take a very much systems approach and multi-policy approach to all of this. And that gets back to my point. If that doesn't start at government level, then it won't happen at the local level.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Catriona. Just finishing off this little round robin on the issue of scale. Chitra, you talked about those commonalities across councils. I suppose it'd be interesting to know where are the sort of key commonalities that we kind of all have to deal with in resilience, that could perhaps be part of a baseline?
Well, I mean, I think there's been a huge amount of work done on that already. As I said, I'm not a planner, I'm not an expert, but if you look at what the Local Government Association have done, what the TCPA have done, is to draw out those commonalities and showcase the case studies where those are available to us. The tricky thing comes from those authorities that are going much further and faster than others. So, the example that Catriona gave, where you have an authority that was trying to gold plate and that ended up not being the best option, not because that was not the right thing to do, but because of what the planning inspectorate's response was. But I think there's a lot of examples of local authorities just trying to do something around resilience in their local plans. There are planning policy, local plans out there that you can literally just lift and shift and change a few things. I think, so for me, it is about recognizing that not everything has to be started from scratch. There is a lot out there, and this duplication of effort is something that we've been doing for 20 years now, if not more. There's this constant need for innovation. Every funding opportunity out there, whether it's for resilience or mitigation, is for innovation, not for implementation of all of the innovation that's come before and is now ready to go. So I think there's a real problem with, this constant need to develop something new when actually a lot of what we need is already there. It just needs to be done. And I'll come back to the fact that the reason it's not being done is because there isn't a statutory duty for it to be done in the same way that there are for other things. Developers push back quite strongly against some of these policies, and the skills and capacity are not there. So, I think Samir said something really critical, which is that we need planners who are multidisciplinary, and those days are gone. When I joined Hampshire, that's what planners were, and they were strategic planners. That's why we worked so closely with CERA and CEDA at the time, because we absolutely recognized that, planning at a local level is really challenging, and some of the things that Catriona pulled out, I remember that conversation about reservoirs, where's that gone? We're facing water scarcity in the future and we're not having that conversation. Even if you take it out of the resilience arena and you look at renewable energy, and you take a county like Hampshire, you cannot expect districts to be allocating land within a district area for big renewable energy schemes. the likelihood is that they're going to say, we don't have anything. So we start to look at it at a county scale, it starts to make a little bit more sense. And then you look at it at a regional scale, then it really does make a lot more sense. And it's the same with everything, whether it's retrofit or everything else. Doing retrofit at a, district level is not viable. It's not going to work because you need the scale, the economies of scale to make things happen. So I think, yeah, there's sort of multiple issues with scale, but there's also, when it comes to something very simple, not simple, but something like the local plan, there are plenty of examples out there that are already available that don't need reinvention. The issue, I think, comes back to what Samira was saying around the skills and capacity of that multidisciplinary approach and being able to see holistically across all of the different policies and making sure that they are interconnected and they're mutually beneficial. And another layer to add to that is, the social justice element. So when we talk about planning for climate change, both mitigation and resilience, there is a real propensity to make those people who are already in the sort of most deprived areas worse off, because that's where, that's unfortunately, we don't have the skills or the knowledge to do this in the way that, requires us to make sure that we take account of those communities. So there's a real problem where, for example, you're talking about low emission zones and public transport. If there is the access to all of that for everyone, then it works. But if your deprived communities are the ones where the access is limited and they're then being penalized for bringing their cars in, then, you're just making things worse. So it's really tricky, really complicated.
Yeah, that's I'm going to pick up on Yitong Jing's question. I'm going to come to the first written question from Rumana Kabir afterwards, because I think what you just said there, Chitra, kind of dovetails with this, where Yitong asked, you mentioned participation and resources of the problem. Will community or public engagement have an impact on this issue? And it makes me think about the ULEZ, because here I live in South London. Here in London, the ULEZ, like participation, LTNs, I mean, it's been a whole thing. And it doesn't necessarily accelerate measures. So it'd be interesting to get the panel's thoughts, start with yourself, Chitra, on how public participation can sort of best be factored into all this.
I think there are different definitions of what we think public participation is, and that's another big issue. We all do our consultations at local government level, and about 400 people out of, 1 million respond, and they're probably the same 400 people that responded to every other consultation that we've put out, and that is not public participation. Co-creation is something that's gaining more and more traction in terms of really understanding what the community needs are and not going in with an already kind of established plan that you're then trying to convince everyone to buy into. It's almost like, what does that community need and how is it going to be co-designed to ensure that it meets their needs and therefore they can, use it and engage with it. And that's really not easy, and it's really challenging and requires a specific skill set that, again, I'm not sure many of us in sort of local government have that. Having said that, I think when you do get public participation and you do get buy-in and you do get proper engagement, then yeah, it's a hugely impactful. And I think it comes up with solutions that maybe you wouldn't have considered previously. I think it means that, you can take account of different parts of the community. So yeah, I mean, I would say that public participation is critical, but my issue is that we don't know how to do it well, and it takes a lot of skill to do it right and a lot of time, which is often the thing that we don't have.
Right, and it often takes, that same thing we've been talking about, missing institutional memory, because people get frustrated when they find that they're being asked the same questions over and over again by different people. Catriona, your thoughts on the issue of community and public engagement and how it can impact on the issue?
So I'm going to be a dinosaur again and hark back to the past. When I think it was at 2000 Wellbeing Act, so there was a duty of wellbeing placed on all local authorities, and out of that we had sustainable community strategies, and every authority had to develop their sustainable community strategy with community forums. And the public engagement in that, because it was a strategy that was about how local authorities were delivering well-being, supporting well-being. They had a statutory duty, and it was about environment, community, economic well-being, climate well-being, everything packed into that. And that was the overarching commitment of each local authority to their community. And that was also the overarching commitment to every strategy that sat underneath that, including things like local plans, local transport plans, and everything else. I thought it worked brilliantly in most places. It didn't work so good in other places, but we were going on very much in a learning journey about how you bring in communities, and it was as much about them learning as us learning, you know. So you know, having local communities involved in anything like this, they're not there. You will get experts, but a lot of them, you're taking them on the journey too. And I think that co-learning process was one of the best things about it. And I think with resilience, however you define it, I think we're in the same place. We need to build these networks. So I know that Samir will know more about this. You know, Brighton's got a climate forum. There's a lot of forums, community forums being built to support local authorities in terms of climate change. And I think from a planning perspective, again, for local plans, we're trying to shift how we participate, communicate, engage with local communities into a very different direction. But it's back to that point about resourcing and skills. You know, we need to actually redistribute some of our skills and our ability and our priorities in local government to deal with community engagement. We're just adding on more and more with the same skills and the same resources. So if we are going to seriously take on public participation in a meaningful way for whatever purpose, then we need to skill up, we need to resource, and we need to do it properly.
Thanks very much, Catriona. That's great. And Samir, your thoughts on the issue of community participation, engagement, etc. Oh, you're on mute, Samir.
Yeah, there you go. Someone had to do it eventually. So I think there's two parts, and I think both Chitra and Catriona have touched upon some of the critical bits here and the tools that we have. I think I'll start off saying, look, we've got all of the tools that we need. You know, there's a question of whether your local authorities are using the right tools for the situations they are in. But again, without going into the details, there's not a lot that we can say on that. I think people and taking people with you, if you are embarking on a resilience journey, is important. Okay, but you also need to take your politicians with you, and I'll tell you how the two are connected. And I don't think you can do one without the other. And Glasgow is a very good example of this. So Glasgow embarked on its city resilience journey probably in 2015, I think. And they launched a strategy in September, would have been September 2016. You know, so and that happened a while back. And that strategy had 4 pillars, and one of those pillars was empowering Glaswegians. You know, and that was important because the way the city designed that, in that it tied that into something else the city was doing in terms of how the city was marketing Glasgow at the time. And the thing that empowering Glaswegians pillar in the Glasgow resilience strategy tied to was the campaign People Make Glasgow. And that meant people could actually relate to that, you know, and by allowing people to relate to that, they then felt that they had a stake and ownership in the resilience work that was happening. But it also sat alongside a lot of the work that Glasgow was doing at the time, building the site for the Commonwealth Games. You know, so there were a few things happening at the same time, which actually meant that when you look at all of that stuff in totality, meant that when Glasgow hosted COP26, Glasgow was actually in a very good place because it had already joined all of the dots that the city needed to join. And Glasgow's resilience journey, and this is where the politics of it becomes important, started in probably 2014, 15, and in some respects 16, under a Labour administration in the city, which then was very ably carried forward by Susan Aitken and her team when they led the city, probably from early days of 2017, I think. You know, so that political transition was important, but it also that you had a resilience journey that had people at its heart, that politicians of all, in this case, two different parts of the spectrum, felt that they could own it, because it's not that common that, you have something that is happening in a city that is owned by politicians coming in from different parties. Parties normally say, well, it's started by another party, we don't particularly want to own that. But actually that ownership carried on, which meant the city's journey and momentum carried on as well. So it's the politics, it's the people. And while all of this was happening, you then had a space, or maybe a place within Glasgow City Council, where all resilience knowledge and all community work sat. And it sat with one particular team that looked after the resilience strategy, but also, the team that was working with, the campaign People Make Glasgow, for example. So all of these things are critical, in a sense, if you want to take the people with you. So they need to be seen, they need to be visible. And I think when Glasgow launched the resilience strategy, and it was in a whiskey distillery on the other side of the M8, and they had school kids, they were a big part of the day's celebration for that strategy, because again, you're not only bringing the school kids on board, but you're also bringing their parents and their carers and their families on board. So that's that thread that kind of runs through. And not a lot of places, are able to do that. Not a lot of places are able to invest in this. And a lot of places don't even think about resilience in this way. But it seems it has worked, and it seems to be continuing to work for Glasgow. Again, judging by how frequently Susan Aitken is visible on all sorts of platforms, talking about the work that they're doing.
Yeah, no, you've got to have those golden threads, don't you? I want to just do a quick round robin from Rumana Kabir's question from the top of the Q&A, which was about best practice and where you might find it and what it might look like. So I thought just do a quick run round and ask what an example, if everyone gives an example of what they think is good practice in the resilience space, and if possible, where more information can be found about that. So I'll start in reverse now. Samir.
Where's the best practice? I mean, I put in the link to the definitions there from this Resilient Cities Network, and they have, something like 100 cities working on resilience, and that's the team I work with. So there's a lot of case studies there of good practice. A lot of it is North American, but also you'll find a lot of, again, cross-Atlantic pieces of work, which were interesting. And the RSA has done a lot of stuff facilitating conversations, again, between Glasgow, Detroit, and a few others. That's part of the RSA's work on placemaking, for example. There are good examples of resilience happening in places like Madrid, Barcelona. A lot of those, again, they're really good European example, but they're on the infrastructure side. So it's public spaces and how you use public spaces to then build social and economic resilience. There's a lot of stuff on infrastructure resilience, and the Dutch are always a very good example, particularly water and flooding. The TE 2100, I think there are some really good examples there on investing in hard infrastructure, probably not so much in the social, particularly as you begin to look at that social divide and that social disparities that kind of stretch across that Thames line as it moves from east to west. I think probably needs a social dimension to it. But again, there's all sorts of examples around water, around disaster resilience, and particularly operating within different frameworks. So there's a lot of lessons out there that, no matter what size town or city you are, you can then begin to see what places that had no water, like Cape Town did, or places that are fast disappearing underwater, like Miami are doing.
Brilliant, thank you, Samir. Catriona, any thoughts from you on best practice examples of resilience?
No, I suspect Samir's sort of summed up pretty much it. The only thing I would say is just Chitra mentioned TCPA, that there's a lot of really good information on their website, and it's all free access as well. So definitely worth a look. I can put the link on the chat if you want.
Brilliant, that'd be great. Thank you. And Chitra, you mentioned Reading. What is it about the Reading strategy in particular that caused you to shout out?
Well, I think again it came from the GCPA report. So the case studies are plentiful. And like I said before, there's a lot of really good examples out there, but interesting. I think the question that's actually being asked is how do you get those to be replicated in areas where it's not happening? And unfortunately, at the moment, that is reliant on someone being a champion within your authority, and I assume in Gloucestershire that might have been Nigel Wriggler, so this is the problem at the moment, is those authorities that are really forging ahead and doing great things on resilience is because they've got someone at a high level, who's got the skills, got the capacity, got the kind of wherewithal to know this is a really critical issue and is able to push that through. However, if that doesn't exist in your authority, then you probably are struggling, and that's not something you can just do, and that's not right. I don't agree with the fact that it should only happen where you have a champion. We should all be champions of it. All our politicians should be champions of it. All of our senior leaders should be champions of it. But that's unfortunately not the case. But yeah, I think you can just Google case studies resilience.
You know what, I was referring to Rumana's question, which I actually might have answered. I looked at Luke's question about Gloucestershire and I thought, should I throw that to Chitra at the end? No, that's too mean. But you answered it anyway, so much obliged. Thank you. So yeah, I mean, I think that about brings us into station at 11:56. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending and typing your questions. And it's a huge thanks to our panelists today, Chitra, Catriona, and Samir. This has been really, really helpful. Great talk. And we're going to carry on with this local community act campaign. I think we might have to do something on skills as the next paper, it seems like. So that we'll be back around with that in a few months' time. Thank you very much again, everyone, for joining. Thanks so much, panelists. Hope everyone has a great day and a great week.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you.